Bill Hoeper was in the undertaking business since 1922. He started helping and got his license in 1936 and sold out in 1972. Now he can tell us about the early days and the differences in the way that the funeral business was conducted in those days. There are some changes that have come about in the past 50-some years.
In the first place, the embalming was not done in the funeral home. It was done in the homes of the parties that passed away. Then the relatives came into the store and selected a casket, and we'd take the casket out to the home and dress the people and place them in the casket, and then have the party lying in state in the home until the day of the funeral. Most of the funerals were conducted from the home at that time, and if not entirely from the home, well, then we'd go to the church. And the flowers were, to take care of those was quite a chore. If we were going to the church, they were set up on stands, and they'd have to be taken down and rushed to the church and then set up on the stands again and be all ready when they came with a funeral procession with the casket, and then afterwards going to the cemetery. Then they'd have to be rushed out to the cemetery. I always used flower girls, at least 6 of them, and usually more. And at that time, in the winter time, the roads were not plowed, so we used a team to go to the houses. I can remember one incident where we were called out south of Longwood, and I'd just gotten back from Wausau from a bowling tournament, and Holger Hansen and I left and went out to Benson's, where Guy Benson had passed away. The horses had to walk through the drifts up to their bellies, and then we tied them up and blanketed them and done the embalming and come back into town. The storm was even worse on the way back, and I just got them unhitched, and Hanson had gone into the store, and there was a call for us to go out to Walter's Corners. One of the Neffs had passed away, and so we immediately left and went out to Neff's, and we got in again the next morning about 10 o'clock, and then by that time Benson's had come in to make arrangements for the day of the funeral and so on, and select a casket. At that time they weren't called caskets, they were called coffins, and there were no vaults used at that time until up in the late 20s, when the Clark grave vault came out with a steel vault, weighed 285 pounds, and it sold for $65. And I can remember running across my dad's funeral, which had taken place in 1916, March of 1916, and they just used a wood box for burial and a gray cloth-covered casket, and the entire cost of the funeral was $76.75. 75 cents was for the use of the folding chairs. And then the better coffins at that time were made from solid wood. It would be cherry, oak, walnut, and so forth. And now the majority of the caskets used are steel, from 20 gauge up to probably 12 gauge steel, and concrete vaults. At one time, in the 30s, vault companies came out with a fiberglass vault, but they had run into a lot of trouble. They were strong and acid proof and carry the weight of the earth on top of them, but there was no weight except the weight of the casket and the body in it to hold them down in the ground. If a large rain came up, immediately after the funeral, the water come down alongside of it, and it would float the fiberglass vaults to the top. One end would come out, and they'd have to dig them down, dig them and put them down again. That was the reason they're not used today. Everyone, practically everyone, was embalmed, but of course there was no law that said they had to be embalmed unless they were to be transported by a common carrier, which would be a train or airplane or such. Then the body would have to be embalmed. If it didn't arrive at its destination, it couldn't arrive at its destination for 24 hours after death. See, there's some people that don't believe in embalming one religion, and they should be, and then their religion says they should be buried within 24 hours, if possible, at the time of their death, and not more than 48. And I can remember going on a funeral, leaving the funeral home with a team in the wintertime at 8 o'clock in the morning and not getting home till 6 o'clock at night. That was up there in the town of Holloway. I started helping Mr. Grievenau in 1922, go out with him and help bomb at the houses. And I worked there helping him until I finally went to school in 1936 and got my license. Went to school in Chicago at the Worsham School of Embalming. There have been a good many changes made in the digging of the graves since the old times. They all were dug by hand. And the cost at that time was, if you got $10 for opening a grave, was a large sum. And now it's changed, because in the wintertime, one open winter, the ground was froze down to the depths of the grave. And it was a real challenge to get a grave dug in time for the funeral. They used bars and chisels, and finally Hans Paulson bought a air compressor, gasoline air compressor. And then on that account, why some people came out with a gasoline thaw for graves, bottle gas. It was built like a chicken brooder, about 42 inches wide and 8 feet long, and had 2 inches of insulation. And they used a 100-pound drum of gas with a torch that went in one end of it, in the V end, and the flame shot out 3 foot long from this torch when it set at 5 pounds of pressure. And the ground was frozen all the way to the bottom, but they would take the top off and set the thawer in, throw some snow in on the grave after they had the sod off, and then set the compressor down in the part they'd taken off so it was airtight, and turn it on, let it run all night, and use a 100 or 60-pound drum of gas to thaw the entire grave. But by morning the thing would be thawed all the way to the bottom. Now that's changed over to using these tractor diggers with a scoop and a digger on one end and a scoop on the other end, which will go right through the frosty of the ground no matter how deep it is. I worked for Grievenau's, who had started originally in Withee at the Rawson and Grievenau, a hardware store and funeral home, funeral director. Mr. Fred Grievenau was the embalmer. Then his brother Oscar came up and from Chilton in 1906, and they built a hardware store and owned, and they moved down on the 6th of May in 1906 and hauled their entire stock. They had a big snowstorm. They hired hauled the entire stock on sleighs from Withee to Owen. And then Oscar even obtained a license as an embalmer, funeral director, and he continued as embalmer and funeral director until his death in 1945. And then I started my own funeral home in 1954 in the former Dr. Dyke residence, which I remodeled. And I sold my share of it in James Marina the last day of 1972.
Thank you, Mr. Hoeper, very much for participating in our oral history. You are a valuable part of this area history, and the Library of Withee wants to thank you for sharing your past and your thoughts with us. This has been V. Keskimaki talking to Bill Hoeper. Today, February 17th, 1981, we are talking to William Bill Hoeper, capital Hoeper, in their home on the outskirts of Owen. Bill was born in 1906 at Phlox, Wisconsin, next to an Indian reservation 16 miles from Antigo. His grandparents were born in Germany. His father, Fred, came from Neenah, Wisconsin, and mother, Rosina, from Menasha, Wisconsin. Bill attended school in Phlox, and in 1913 they moved to the Owen area. Bill's father died in 1916, leaving behind 9 children. Bill graduated from Owen High School in 1923. He is going to tell us some of the interesting logging stories in this area.
This is the story of W.S. Irvine, of the old times when they cut the timber, white pine timber, in Clark County. This took place in 1866. This story was told to me by Will S. Irvine, who lived in Owen, and he was up in his 80s, and he was in the filling station at night talking to several fellows about old times, and then he told this story about the old logging times. He was hired by a logging firm from Davenport, Iowa, to make camp ready north of Owen. So he came up through the woods from southern Clark County and met an Indian right where Owen is now in the ash swamp. He talked with him for a while and then kept on his way. He carried his groceries, a single barrel shotgun, and a scythe wrapped in burlap and his food supply on his back. He got north of town and found the creek bottom there on the Jens Jurgensen farm, and he made himself a shelter out of the woods so he'd have a place to stay in bad weather, and he made himself the rest of the tools. He had to make a snaz for the scythe and make a pitchfork and a rake out of the woods for preparing the hay. Cut the green marsh grass along the creek bottoms. A 3-tine pitchfork out of the woods and a wooden rake to rake up the hay. And he cut all the marsh grass on the creek bottoms in that area, in the area where they were going to build a lumber camp. Piled it all up in haycocks, and then when more men came up in the fall, they carried it in and made a stack next to the barn where they kept the oxen. Later on in the summer, the men came in with the oxen to cut the roads for harvesting the pine. Where the old mill pond is now was a creek bottom. And they cut a road down this creek bottom from north until they got to the area of where the old dam is, and they had an iced road from the woods all the way down to the bottom of this hill and then up the hill. And they used oxen to pull the timber in. They used 2 teams of oxen to bring in the loads, and then they had to hook on another load, a team of oxen, to bring the loads up the hill. The oxen were sharp shod so they wouldn't slip on the ice. And they decked the timber in the area where A.R. Owens' house, Couturi's house, the old boarding house where Dick Hughes' house is now, and the company office. That was all covered with rollways of timber, which would go down the river when it was the flood. River was in flood in the spring. In the wintertime, they went out, it was pitch dark with their teams of oxen to harvest the timber and haul it in. And they had to put a lantern on the on the yoke of the lead team of oxen. I asked him what this was for, and he said to prevent the timber wolves from attacking the oxen while it was dark, while they were going out to work. And they worked in this area all winter, and they had their cook shanty, sleeping shanty, and ox barn on the Jens Jorgensen farm. When he was plowing this area where the logging camp had been, he often wondered where all the cast iron came from on the north side of a creek, how it happened to get over there. He plowed it out of the ground. And then they left on the 16th of March, they had a head of water. The snow had all melted, and they had made a place to ride on behind to follow the drive. They had a raft made out of solid logs, and then they had sleeping quarters built on it and a cook's hut built on it. And they floated along behind the drive. And then they had a dam, Meeks's Dam, which was constructed by a man by the name of Meeks from southern Clark County. He was the father of Mrs. Percy Clifton in Owen, whose husband was a barber in Owen for 50 years. And on the 16th of March, they marked all their logs and broke out the rollways and poured them down the hill into the river. And then when they got them down to the dam, why, they had a big head of water, and they opened the dam and kept rolling in the balance of the logs. And they went down across the rapids behind what is now the Chuck Pribineau farm. And all the way down the Popple River to Black River, and down past Greenwood area, which was just very few homes, and Neilsville, going all the way down to La Crosse. There they gathered the logs together in the backwater, and they put chains with spikes on and made rafts out of them. Held the logs together in big rafts. Then they pushed them out. They had tugboats that pulled them out into the Mississippi River and let go of them and pulled away, and then they floated down the Mississippi River. And they went down to as far as Davenport, Iowa. And I asked what happened then, and he says they pulled the rafts into the side of the bank and tied them up and had the mills there to saw this pine into lumber. I said, what did you do then? Well, we got paid for working all winter. Then we took the stagecoach back from Davenport, Iowa to La Crosse, and we walked back up the Black River and the Popple River to cut the grass on the creek bottoms for the next year's cut of logs. And Mr. Irvine said that a mile north of Owen on the old Charlie Tompkins 40 that should have been set aside as a historical marker, with a historical marker, because this 40 had the most pine of any, best crop of pine that there was in the state of Wisconsin. He told me how many feet they cut off it, but I can't. That's the only thing I can't remember, is how many feet they cut off of that 40 acres. But in my own memory, I can remember Tompkins' cows being out in the pasture, and the pine stumps were 4 foot across and bigger than that. And they were so thick the cows could hardly walk between them. And that's just where this flowage is that they build up there now, right north of town.
That's all.
That's all. He told me how much the money. They arrived in Davenport, Iowa on the 16th of June in 1867. Took them 90 days to make the trip down from Owen through all those rivers. Then I have another story about accident in the sawmill for John S. Owen Lumber Company. This happened in about 1928. Otto Graff was working on the resaw, and one of the edgings from a piece of hemlock got caught in the saw and smoothed backwards and went right through him. So the point stuck out of his back 3 feet, and the other 12 feet of the edging was sticking out of the front of him. Hans Clausen was riding on the carriage with George Schamberger, and he immediately stopped the carriage, and he knew where there was a handsaw, and he got it for the fellows, and then they sawed the thing off and left about 6 inches protruding from his back and 6 inches from his abdomen. Out from his abdomen they sawed it off, and Hans had run over to the company office and had him call up the depot and hold number 1 until they took him over there to the train. They took him to Chippewa Falls to the St. Joseph's Hospital, and Dr. Williams removed this piece of hemlock, which is the most poisonous wood there is, and Otto recovered and lived until he was up in his 60s, until he fell out of a boat while he was fishing over at Wausau and drowned in the Wisconsin River.
That sounds good.
Yeah, it really is. And what other one should I tell about?
I don't know.
Tell about the 2 guys that on some of these drives that died of pneumonia while they were driving across this dam, Meeks's Dam, south of Owen, and they're buried on the west shore of the Popple River on the old Wally Haviland, 60 acres. And another lumberjack come back years later, and they put 2 rocks at the head of the graves, and he found them and scratched the dates of their birth and the dates of their death on these rocks. And talking about others, Frank Krieger told me about on the farm right across from there, Skitty Corner South, the old Jurgen Larson farm. There's a number of children buried in the orchard there. And Tony Johnson told me that when the mill was operating where the Riverside Cemetery is now, his family lived out there, and they had an epidemic of scarlet fever, and there's 4 of his brothers and sisters were buried out there, but not in the cemetery. They were buried across the road on the south side. That's in that Alfred Frost field. Isn't that something? How
Turn it up.